Syria's military says its troops have regained control of northwestern territories in the country in record time. The announcement came just hours after the country consolidated its hold over the key Aleppo province. The regime is also taking aim at one of the country's last rebel-held strongholds in Idlib province. A Turkish delegation is in Russia today to discuss the situation there as aid workers and activists warn of a potential humanitarian crisis. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News State Department and Foreign Affairs reporter Christina Ruffini. Good to see you, Christina.
Good morning, Vlad.
So give our viewers some context. Why is the Syrian government going after Idlib?
As you mentioned, it is one of the last big strongholds for opposition forces, which is why the Syrian army, assisted by Russian air power, launched this violent assault against the city, trying to take it back. And there are about 3 million people living there and in the surrounding areas, many of which were bused there trying to escape violence in other parts of the country. So they've already left home at least once. Now they're on the run again, trying to escape this new onslaught. The problem is there's really nowhere for them to go.
So what are the consequences going to be for the people living there? And if they have to leave, is there anywhere for them to go?
No, because the shelling in Idlib has actually caused the biggest single humanitarian migration since the start of the war. The UN says it's 800,000, mostly women and children, are on the move, and they're being kind of penned into this small area between advancing Syrian forces and the Turkish border. The problem is the Turkish border is sealed. Since the start of the war 9 years ago, Turkey has absorbed about 4 million Syrian refugees. And as the head of their Foreign Affairs Committee told me last week, he said, we've had it up to here. He said they cannot let any more Syrians into their country. So what's happening is all these people are basically stuck there, and they're showing up at these refugee camps that are already overflowing. Aid workers on the ground have reported a lack of food, a lack of sanitation, and mothers so hungry that they can't produce milk for their newborn children, so they're feeding them chamomile and herbal tea. The Turkish government has said it's going to send some meals and winter clothes to the Syrian side of the border to try to help take care of them on the Syrian side where they are in these camps. But, you know, blankets and meals may not be enough to prevent what even U.S. officials are warning is an impending humanitarian disaster.
When you hear those numbers, Christina, 4 million refugees,
they're really staggering.
It really is this late into this war that many people thought would be over much quicker than it is now. Let me ask you about the U.S. and its role. Is the United States planning on getting involved?
It doesn't seem so. As we mentioned earlier, the Russians have basically underwritten Assad. Assad, by most estimates, would not still be there if the Russians hadn't come to back him up with air power, as they're doing in Idlib. And, you know, the U.S. has said it's really bad. Jim Jeffrey, who's the envoy for Syrian affairs, has warned that this is a problem, has said, you know, the Turkish forces and the Russians need to work it out. The Turks have said the best way for them to help the refugees is to convince the Russians to stop their campaign. But the U.S., you know, as Robert O'Brien told Margaret Brennan when she asked him about it last week, he basically said, you know, asking the U.S. to come up with a solution, that's not a real thing. Like, there's no real reason the U.S. is going to be able to solve this. For the most part, U.S. officials are saying, yes, it's a problem, but us fixing it isn't even a real argument.
All right, Christina, let me ask you about Afghanistan. We're still waiting for a formal announcement of a 7-day reduction in violence between the United States and the Taliban. What do we know about this temporary truce, and more importantly, what would follow after?
Well, it's interesting because it's not a ceasefire, and they're not calling it a ceasefire. It's a reduction in violence agreement, which means the U.S. would like them to kill fewer people, but acknowledges that the negotiators in Doha may not have command and control over all the different groups throughout the country and can't guarantee that everybody is going to lay down their arms. Now, once the clock starts on that, and it hasn't yet, it needs to hold for 7 days, and if that happens, we can move on to next steps. So they've asked for a reduction of violence. It needs to hold, and what are those next steps? Well, we're still working on what we think they're going to be. But after the 7 days, the U.S. and Taliban would sign a peace deal. Then the Taliban negotiators would have 10 days to basically pick their teams and enter inter-Afghan negotiations. Now, that's not saying those have to be finished in that time, but they have to name who's going to handle those negotiations for each side, which has been a problem in the past. At one point, more than 200 people from the Afghan government showed up to something and were trying to each say that they were the different negotiators. So once they get into that process, then the U.S. troops could start to gradually withdraw over the next 18 months. But there's a lot of contingencies, and it's all based on conditions on the ground.
Christina, you mentioned the Afghan government. So these talks are between the United States and the Taliban. But how does President Ashraf Ghani feel about this?
So President Ghani had been very critical of these talks, but in the last few weeks seems to have come on board and thrown his support behind the process. But it was, it was a task to get the U.S. and the Taliban to this point. The bigger lift will be the actual details of who's going to be in charge of what part of Afghanistan and what that means for the people living there, including the women and girls who now have a constitutionally enshrined right to things like education, something the Taliban did not allow when it ran the country. So we'll have to see what unfolds in the weeks and probably months to come.
All right, Christina Ruffini for us, breaking it down. Thank you so much, Christina, as always.
Thanks, Vlad.